Okay. Has What I wanted to focus on today was the Robin DiAngelo book, White Fragility. How many of you were able to read that?
I got the first couple of chapters. That's as far as I've got.
So it's about
That's
140 pages. What the reason I wanted to focus on this book first is because uh, she tries to delve into the reasons why we don't want to talk about the subject of racism. On the news this morning, as an example, there were two police officers in Georgia, the chief of police and a deputy, that were fired because they forgot and left their body cams on, and it recorded them having a conversation that, they didn't own slaves, they weren't racist, and they had no reason to talk about this, and they were sick of all these blacks. And then it just kind of spiraled down into racial epithets and just some pretty atrocious things that they were caught saying. But the beginning of their conversation is typically the beginning of a lot of conversations when it comes to racism. It's like, either that's the Civil War and that's history, or my family never owned slaves, or I didn't have anything to do with that and I don't want to talk about it. So DiAngelo tries to delve into the subject of why we as white individuals are so reluctant to broach the subject and why we're so resistant. Uh, so let's just start out with that. What do you think of her premise? Have you run across that?
I think it's just human nature not to want to talk about anything that's uncomfortable. And it's hard. It's hard for, it's kind of like if you're, depends on your personality. If you want to always spread sunshine and positive thoughts, that's one of the hardest things I think for me to talk about, is because that brings up a lot of upset. It's not something I, that is easy to talk about. I guess that's maybe what I'm trying to say.
Well, and my thing is, I'm always afraid that I'm going to say something that will offend. I mean, I really, after reading some of this, I'm thinking that's part of my problem. I don't want to offend anybody, and I'm able to say something.
Saying the wrong thing. Any other thoughts? So she lists in chapter 3 on page 39 uh, several things that she's heard as she has worked through this issue. She says children today are so open. When the old folks die off, we will finally be free of racism. Or I grew up in a small rural community, so I was very sheltered. I didn't learn anything about racism. Or I judge people by what they do, not who they are. I don't see color. I see people. We're all red under the skin. Or I marched in the 60s. Things I've come across in my experience is, this is ancient history, or why am I just trying to stir up trouble? I've heard the word agitating used a lot, that if you try to talk about this subject, you're just agitating and trying to get people stirred up over nothing. Had a friend tell me he's obviously not racist because he coaches little league with a bunch of black kids, so that exempts him from being racist. Uh, just thoughts like that. That kind of, it's meant to kind of just shut down the conversation, and we're not going to discuss it anymore. And DiAngelo, that book really delves into that with her experiences. And I think that'll be a good way for us to start out, is to kind of face those excuses in our country of why, after, what's it been, 60 years since civil rights, and we're doesn't seem like we've made a whole lot of progress. For me, I think the shocking thing about the last year on my social media with people I thought I knew, I don't know if they've always believed some of the racial things they have believed, that they've always believed that, or somehow they feel emboldened to share it now. But I've had to delete and block and unfriend and unfollow several people because they had just started trolling me on Facebook and responding with racial and racist messages about everything. We have currently in the Congress a representative from Georgia, and they're publishing a lot of her past videos and posts and that demonstrate she is a hardcore racist. And the Capitol attack was organized by a lot of white supremacist groups. And yet a lot of people in our country want to pretend that we don't have racial issues, or it's just a small group of people that are agitating. What shocked me this year for Black Lives Matter, we still have people sitting in jail after they've been arrested for those protests. And those protests were met with immediate and violent responses by our government. Tear gas, guns, police brutality. And yet the Capitol insurrection, they wouldn't even allow the National Guard to gather to protect them. And it was left totally up to the Capitol Hill police to try to fend off that mob, even though they knew it was coming. And then after many of these people were arrested, I've been following a lot of these cases. A lot of them have been let out of jail because they're just good people. And yet there are Black protesters from July still sitting in jail. And then this morning I ran across another news event. It was a 9-year-old African-American girl who had an anxiety attack at school. And the school called the police, and the police put her in handcuffs. And then to get her to calm down, the cop told his deputy to spray her with pepper spray as she's in the back seat of the car having an anxiety attack. And a lot of people commented, I can guarantee you this would have happened if it would have been a little white girl. And so, you know, that stuff kind of bothers me because we're not talking about it. We're not talking about that discrepancy between how we respond to whites and to Blacks.
You know, listening to you, this is Betty DeMarco, and I'm in New Orleans. I grew up in, well, I'd say I grew up in Arkansas, but a friend of mine told me recently, if I moved to New Orleans when I was in my 20s, I grew up in New Orleans. So New Orleans is a really different place than being in Arkansas because it's always had such a huge Black influence because we were slave traders. It has such a influence on all of our population. And I would say that probably I have more Black friends in the city at this point in time than I do white friends because I got involved in education reform back in the 90s. And because our school system has always been predominantly private, well, since integration, really, it moved to mostly private and parochial schools, but it's always been that way because we were a slave city and people didn't want to be in school even in the 1900s with Black. So it's been an interesting living here and having to work on myself for a long time, which I started doing back in 2000. I realized that a lot of my issues were judging other people for absolutely no reason. You know, I didn't have any reason to judge that person. And so I really started working on me, I'd say late 90s, maybe even a little before that. And it's really, it's been very interesting to be here because I realized so many of my Black friends here grew up exactly like I did, middle income family, educated parents, either educators, doctors. And so it's been interesting to look at what's happening now and understand that there is this huge population of people that are still back in the 50s, in the 60s. And I think about it. I think about it a lot, and have really determined that it's really working. It's working on each one of us. To me, anyway, that's where you have to start. You got to realize that, you know, we've all got issues and stories, and learning from those. So it's interesting being here in this city.
How has the Black Lives Matter protest affected New Orleans?
Well, you know, right after the death of Floyd, we had a lot of protest, lots. Of course, it was during COVID, so it was limited to a lot of younger people, not as many older ones. We had absolutely no violence whatsoever. We did have one evening that the police decided that they were going to keep the protesters off of the Mississippi River Bridge, which they had decided to cross, where they sprayed pepper spray. The next week, the city council condemned the police department for using that type of thing. But an interesting thing, I have a younger, my son is 40, and some of his friends were in the protest, and they commented to me when I talked to them about it, that a lot of the white people there, they thought were there just to be seen, because they kept wanting to have their pictures taken and published on Facebook. So we have not had a lot of, we hadn't had any problems from it at all. We still have we have a lot of mixed groups that are protesting over wages and, you know, not having jobs right now. But the Black Lives Matter protests have been pretty quiet since right after Floyd.
Interesting. Anyone else?
Well, you commented about in this book about when you're from a rural area that you don't have any experience with racism. That was true in my raising. I was raised as a dairy farmer's daughter outside of Little Rock. And I guess I was too young to remember the big thing with Central High School. It didn't ever, I don't recall anything about that, but I did not grow up in a family that had any experience with racism and was never taught racism from my parents ever. I didn't really know what racism was until I moved to Baltimore, Maryland. And I was totally, I had seen a part of human nature that I had never seen before. And of course, you know, they made fun of me in Maryland because of my Southern accent. And the first comment to me in college, I had transferred at college, was some young man in my class said, "Well, are they still teaching you won the Civil War?" And, you know, that just shocked me that came from, you know, I was being treated differently because of my accent. And, Yet, you know, Maryland is below the Mason-Dixon line as well. So I couldn't understand where all this comes from. You know, I have no knowledge of all that. So I think being naive about it and not in an environment where we are faced with it on a daily basis, we do become complacent. We really don't understand why there is racism, you know, until you get into these situations. And I guess, you know, if you live in an area where you're afraid for your life, whether you're black or white, maybe that fear instigates some of this stuff, but I don't know. But coming from my background, it's totally, it's hard for me to conceive why it would be so much of it.
Well, I grew up in a really small town in central Missouri, and my grandmother was horribly prejudiced. And she had black help, or at that time they called it darky help, which, you know, but the thing that she treated them okay, but yet she treated them like, I mean, they paid them, but basically she, you know, they weren't allowed to eat with them. They weren't allowed to be in the same room, you know, this kind of a thing. And my mom got sick, and Miss Ivy, we called her Miss Ivy. We all loved Miss Ivy. Miss Ivy came and helped my mom. And of course, my mom wasn't the least bit, you know, racist, or at the time we didn't call it racist. We just, you know, it was okay. And so Miss Ivy fixed us lunch one day, and we said, sit down and have lunch with us. She says, oh no, baby, your grandma would just have a fit. And we convinced her to come and sit with us. So I was seeing two different sides as I was growing up. And basically the little town we lived in, there was a lot of black help, but everybody was paid. But I don't know that I saw the racism at that point, except like my grandmother, she made it very clear. But I don't know that I'm kind of like you. I don't know that I really saw it in this small town until I started going to high school and saw it in a bigger city.
I grew up in can you hear me? I was trying to talk before and I was having sound issues. Am I coming through now?
Yeah, you're coming
Yeah.
through.
Cool. I grew up in a small town in South Dakota, and I think I was 16 before I laid eyes on a person of color. And it was more a matter of, we were just all ignorant. We lacked experience with anyone that didn't look like us. Actually, I was considered kind of odd man out because I was an Irish Catholic instead of a Norwegian Lutheran. And so it was, and I really didn't, even when I went to college, one of the larger colleges in South Dakota, I really did not interact a whole lot with people of color. So I feel great empathy and sadness and grief for what people of color have experienced, but to actually say I have come personally in contact with it, no. And I live in Duluth now. I've lived in Minnesota most of my adult life, so it hits home, you know, the George Floyd riots and protests. We have family members down in the Twin Cities. My nephew and my brother-in-law are both in the National Guard, and they were called out. So it hits close to home. And, you know, we kind of like to be complacent and think, oh, I'm in Minnesota and we're really progressive here. Well, guess what? George Floyd happened in Minnesota. So it was a real eye-opener for me. And again, I feel like I've tried to live a fairly diverse life, but I've not had access to a lot of diversity. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here, is because I do feel such great empathy, but I don't know what I can do about it. So it's fun meeting some like-minded people.
So one of my first experiences when I became a minister, I was sent to a small town in South Arkansas.
Yeah.
And this was in Warren. And I used to joke with them that nobody ever told them they had lost the Civil War. I grew up in the Ozarks. There weren't any black people that we were around. And so I'd just grown up thinking this was ancient history. You know, Martin Luther King died before I was born. Uh, and then I got there and discovered there was a whole culture. And I remember the matriarch of the church, she had African American help, but they were strictly told they could not speak to us. They could not, they had to show deference. They had to step out of the way if we were walking through the house. And it was all stuff that just really jarred me to see that still going on. And none of them thought anything of it. And they would tell you every day, no, we're not racist. And yet I would see these little hints of, yeah, but we're still in charge. And then I was transferred to a church in Camden, and I had a little 2-point charge. The little small one was called Buena Vista. And I invited our African district superintendent. He was from Liberia. He was the vice president and the bishop of that country. And he was overthrown in a coup, and he came here, became our district superintendent. I invited him to speak at a revival at that little church. And I stepped in a hornet's nest that I didn't know was going on. And it was a year-long fight. It was ugly. I mean, they filed charges against me with the bishop the day I got married. I got a certified letter. Here are the charges. You know, we're not what he did to us. I was told over and over, you just don't get it. We have to eat with them, but we're never going to have to worship with them. And I was just in the middle of this reeling, going, I thought we were past this. We got through it. I lost several members of that church, and several others were just hardline, we will not change. But many others said, you know, I guess we've never thought about it, and nobody's ever talked to us about it, and nobody's ever called us out for it. And those people we had a great conversation with about why you think the way you do. And they started to see life in a different angle. I had stressed to them, a lot of them had kids, and I said, you can't let your kids grow up in a multicultural world with these attitudes. They'll never make it through college. They'll never hold down a job. Of course, that was back 20 years ago. I didn't realize what we have uncovered here lately, but that just shook me to the core. I had a man who claimed he was from the KKK visit me one night and describe what they did to people like me and he used the phrase agitated. And I'm a young seminary grad thinking, that's all ancient history. And yet here you are on my doorstep. And then when I went with the Navy, this racism was a huge issue because it really hurt the morale and welfare and the readiness of our forces. And when I was sent to Iraq, this was really brought home because I dealt with people that felt, hey, I'm black, but this kid over here flies the Confederate flag, and I don't know what's the difference between him and this guy in ISIS trying to kill me. Is he going to carry me off the battlefield? And that really awakened in me what symbols can mean to people and how hurtful they can be. I mean, this guy was literally worried if his brothers in arms would actually be there for him because they were flying Confederate flags and talking about their white heritage and their heroes of the Confederacy. We had to battle that in the Navy, trying to get people to understand this isn't just a white world. This is blacks and Hispanics and Asians, and we're all wearing the same uniform. But when you say these things and fly these symbols, this is what it makes everybody else feel like. And that we caught hell over that. You know, how dare you take my flag, or how how dare you criticize my heritage? And it's like, I'm from the South too, but that's not my heritage. And that was my experience, thinking it's ancient history to, oh my gosh, there's people still believe this. And then seeing the stark pain it does cause in people of color and different minority statuses.
I'm glad you brought that up, because in reading this book, I didn't quite get why, they wanted to tear down all these statues, and why, the flag thing I got more than anything. But I was looking at it from a white point of view. I was looking at it as history. And so when I'd see that, I would think, well, that wasn't a good person. It was a bad person. But I didn't think of it from the other point of view. So this has really made me turn around and see now that, that they're seeing it different than we're seeing it. And I don't know that it's not either one of us' fault exactly, but now I'm feeling better that I see it from their eyes. That's made me feel better.
I think D'Angelo really brings out, there is overt racism where you just hate people of color and blah, blah, blah. But she goes, what we need to deal with is the unseen racism.
Right.
As white people, we make all these assumptions and then wonder, why are you offended? Why are you upset? Because we're blind, because we've grown up in a dominant culture and we don't stop to look, oh, what I said or what I did, maybe that is offensive to someone of color. And I never realized that until I got in the military and I was the chaplain to all people. And I started listening to their hurt and pain. It's like, oh, this stuff does matter. And I think that's D'Angelo's point, is when you start talking on that angle, most people in this country, we're not racist. We're not the KKK. We're not Confederates. But at the same time, when we don't want to do anything about police brutality, or if we don't want to do anything about Confederate symbols, if we're just ignoring all this, I think that, she says, is also racism too, because we're not willing to walk a mile in someone else's shoe, or at least attempt it, to try to understand.
Well, I have just I taught school back in the 90s in Camden, and I had a Black principal, female, who I absolutely adored. And one day in the spring, we were having field day. Now, you have to understand, I never lay in the sun. I never get a suntan. I'm real white. And so it was field day in May, and everybody was to wear their shorts. And I said to Eloise, I said, I envy you for your skin color, never thinking that that would be offensive. Well, it did. But luckily we were close enough that she told me, she said, Jeanette, that was very hurtful what you said. And I mean, I never thought about it. Never, I just thought, well, you're lucky you don't have to go put a spray tan on when you go out with your shorts on. But, it's just, we don't see it. I didn't realize it.
When you just grow up in it,
That's right.
You just don't understand.
No.
And I don't know if I still understand, but I'm starting to.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we learn a lot every day. And Jackie, I was going to comment about the statues, because we are one of the cities that we just recently changed street names. We don't have a Robert E. Lee Street any longer. And so when they started taking down the statues, I talked to a couple of my Black friends who said, the mayor is just sidestepping the real issues here. Taking down these statues is not going to help what's happening in this city. But what it did do was start conversations. And a lot of people found out for the first time, those statues were not put up during the Civil War, you know, when Robert E. Lee was around, those statues were put up in the early 1900s to remind Black people, we are still in charge and you are not going to change anything. And so when I said to one of my Black male friends who's the same age as Blake, I said, Farron, I never even noticed I don't pay any attention to the Lee statue. And he started laughing and said, of course not, you're white. Why would you pay attention to it? And it just hit me because I thought, you know, I always think I'm so aware and not a racist. And I was like, you know what, boy, do I have a lot to learn. But it's brought out a lot of discussion. But I got to tell you, New Orleans is still institutionally racist. Our mayors, we may have Black mayors, but they are elected by the white, wealthy population that knows they are not going to make a lot of changes. And so there's still a lot of protest that goes on here for equal pay, housing. We have 30,000 people right now in the city that can't afford to live where they're living, that we're trying to create some affordable housing. So even though we are a predominantly Black city by probably 60, maybe 58% Black, it is still very much institutionalized that white people are going to keep the power in this city. So it's something that I've been working on with a group of women here. And it's hard to have conversations with people about it. And we've been doing some racism work through a couple of different avenues, and it still attracts people like us that want to try to, you know, make a difference and do better. So it's I don't know. I'm probably going to be deceased before this ends. But anyway,
I get a lot of responses to the statues of they never want to talk about the Confederate statues. They immediately deflect to, well, what's next? Is it going to be Washington, Lincoln, blah, blah, blah? And then they'll pull out an example of somebody tore down a statue of Lincoln. And somehow that just covers the entire conversation. And for me, it's hard to get past that. How do you have a conversation when they're deflecting and, you know, wanting to distract you? No, let's talk about this. When I was growing up, my father ran a youth shelter, and it was in the middle of the country, an all white country. And one day we had a 17-year-old African-American boy come. And this kid was huge. He looked like a NFL pro football player. And as I was sitting there talking to him, he was scared to death. And I'm like, you know, I'm a little scrawny kid. And I'm going, what are you scared of? He goes, I don't know what all these white people around here are going to do to me. And that was a real eye opener. And then my wife, who does a lot of medical research, has uncovered, you know, Black men have a lower life expectancy in this country than white people do. And now they're starting to pin that blame on the constant stress of being harassed, of looking over your shoulder, of being picked up for any little petty crime that many of us would get away with. But they're constantly stressed, and they think that's contributing to heart disease, cancers, and all sorts of problems. And that was an angle I had never even thought of how racism is harming the health of a lot of people in this country, which in turn hurts all of us because, you know, insurance, government spending, and yet we don't want to talk about that.
yeah. Well, our Louisiana governor actually, after about 3 or 4 months of COVID, because most of the people dying in Louisiana were Black that lived either around chemical plants, refineries, but in New Orleans, you were not around that, but they have a whole commission now looking at the health of the Black community because of the stress that it's created, high blood pressure, heart disease. And I, having some really close Black friends, that we have had conversations about it. And I don't know, I can't quite figure out how they've survived. It's very sad, because they've struggled because of the color of their skin. So it's real, Blake.
Yeah, I ran across something I hadn't thought of, but somebody mentioned it. They said, as we're rolling out the COVID-19 vaccines, we're targeting this group and this group, those who are impacted the most. And they said, but in the midst of all this, nobody has ever said we need to target Blacks and Hispanics who are dying at disproportional rates. We don't consider them at risk. And they said, why is that? Why are we so blind to that? And it's like, that's an interesting thought of why are we ignoring, if they are dying of higher rates, why are we bypassing them with the vaccines?
This is Wendy. I wanted to share with you guys a couple of things. I don't know if you can see the chat bar. If you click on the bottom, you can see the chat. I posted a link in there for an interview with Robin DiAngelo and Rosima Menachem, who were on Being with Krista Tippett. It is an amazing interview. And he talks a little bit about complicit racism. And Robin DiAngelo talks about the overt and complicit racism as well. And Blake, you had mentioned, how do you have these conversations? And I think the one thing I took from Robin DiAngelo's book was that it has become such a morality issue. And that is why it's hard for people who are not of color to have this conversation, because they immediately think, I'm a bad person because I didn't know, or because I didn't have these experiences, because I don't have empathy. And I think part of it is to say, you don't know what you don't know. And as we begin to know, then we are able to start having dialogue. And I wanted to share an experience that happened on Sunday, like as in 2 days ago. God Hold Brewery did a collaboration. It was a national collaboration back in the summer called Black is Beautiful Beer. And when we brewed this recipe, 100% of the proceeds had to go to an organization that works with social justice and people of color. And we chose to work with Northwest Arkansas Urban League's Young Professionals. And we ended up raising about $2,200 for them. And they came by on Sunday to share with us what they had used the money for. And they're working with a junior high school in Springdale, Arkansas, that is pretty much 100% Latinx and Marshallese. And they said when they rolled schools back into being in person, they didn't have enough supplies, because none of the, all of the school drives that we normally do at the beginning of the school year didn't happen this year, or I guess last year. And so they did a huge school supply drive. But the other thing they did was they realized they have 0 books in their library that represent those cultures, those races, or are in those languages. 0. This is 2021. Think about that. And they bought 600 books for the kids. And as they sit around and told me their own personal stories, and these are all young men and women that are in their mid-20s to mid-30s. One of the young ladies was born in 1988 in Abilene, Texas, and on her birth certificate, her race is described as Negroid. Yeah. She was born my junior year in high school. This is not that long ago. So I feel like, we talk about it and it's hard. I mean, I'm at this point, I'm like way beyond the statues, with all due respect. I'm looking at how is this every single day for people who don't look like me, that I don't have to think about the things that they do. And how do we have these conversations and be willing to be wrong? But the other thing is, and this is what we talked about on Sunday, is I have really no right to talk. At this point, my only job is to say, I am here for you, and listen and try to do better in my actions and my words and my intentions and my thoughts, because I don't have answers. None of us on this call have the answers. The answers have to come from their communities, and we have to listen. And I'll stop talking from there.
Thank you. How do we have these conversations with people? I just recently had one. A couple people were reading the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, and they said, yeah, I get it. We're just awful, but what does that mean for us? What do we do? And it was almost this, they had been hit with the reality that the history that we've been taught is not really the history that's true. And so a lot of people will either shut down and say, I don't believe that, or they'll, yeah, I get it, but I don't know what to do. Like Wendy mentioned, what do we do? I mean, are we listening? Are we compassionate enough to stop and believe and listen to others who are being persecuted and undergoing racism in all of its form? Or are we so resistant because it calls our identity into question? And that was one of the themes of D'Angelo's book, is this just utter resistance to discussing racism because it threatens my identity, that I might have to admit to some things I don't want to admit to. And why is that so hard for us? And how do we sit down with somebody? Because I've tried having these conversations, but it's almost like you hit that brick wall of, I am not talking about it because that's not me. So how do you get past that?
Have any of y'all read Tightrope by Nicholas Kristof?
Yes.
And his wife, who I can't remember her name. He grew up in Oregon and talks, of course it's all white, but he talks about the shame that has been subjected on poor white people, those around him in Oregon. His parents were educated, but most of the people were not, and they were very poor. And he brought up the point that they had that group of his friends that he grew up with, who lived in abusive homes, and then they would go to school and they would be abused because nobody really understood what was going on in their home. He talked about the fact that there was no way in the world that they could relate to what was going on in a Black community, even though it was very much the same, because they were so traumatized. And I wonder if it's not having that conversation and telling stories like we're talking here within the white community, that you get to understand somebody else's story and they hear your story and you become much more empathetic. But I think that's what I see. Jeanette and I have a brother who says he's not a racist, but he is so institutionalized racism, he doesn't even understand it. He says, I work on the oil field with Black guys. I'm not a racist, but he will say the most racist things. And we've gotten to the point where we don't talk to him very much because it constantly comes out. And he's got a lot of issues. And Jeanette and I have talked about this, that until he deals with his own issues, I'm not sure that we can get him, that he can get past his thinking. So we got a lot of healing to do. And I think, as Wendy said, it took me a while to realize there wasn't anything that I could do in the Black community other than say, tell me what you want me to do. I'm standing here. What do you want me to do? But in the white community, we can talk about it and say, everybody's got a story. Let's get through this, or it's not gonna end. It's just gonna keep going.
I recently, a few years ago, made the commitment because I had caught myself just kind of looking the other way when somebody dropped a racial joke or a racial epithet, because, is it worth the fight that's coming? And I finally decided, because of everything happening in our current culture, that yes, it is worth the fight, because part of this is people like me that are just ignoring these sayings and these little quips, and nobody's ever challenged on it. I remember sitting around the table with a man, and he grew up in the 50s, and he was talking about how when the Black kids would walk through his neighborhood, he and his friends would take the apples and persimmons and throw them at the kids. And he started laughing, and then he stopped when he looked at all of us around the table, because we had this look of horror, of, oh my God, you did that? And he goes, maybe that wasn't such a good thing. And he's really made a lot of progress since then of analyzing the things he says, because that finally stopped him and made him think, oh, you guys don't think this is funny, and you have that look of horror. And he started doing some self-reflection, and he's changed. But that only happens if we're willing to each and every time put our foot down and say, I'm not listening to this. Even though it starts all sorts of fights and resistance.
If I may, I want to share two things. One is when I moved back to Phoenix in 2001, my boyfriend and I were driving. He's Mexican American, and we were pulled over, and the county sheriff looked past him. He was driving, looked past him at me and said, "Ma'am, are you okay?" And I was like, yeah, I think so. I'm like totally shocked. And I could see Sam tense. And he said, "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you again, are you okay?" And by this point, I knew what was going on, and I was pretty mad. But I think that moment of being in a car when somebody was racially profiled really, really, really left a pretty big mark on my soul. And there's a Jason Isbell song that came out a couple of years ago, and there's a couple of lines in it that I wanted to share because I think it speaks to what Blake was saying. I heard enough of the white man's blues. I've sang enough about myself. So if you're looking for some bad news, you can find it somewhere else. Last year was a son of a bitch for nearly everyone we know, but I ain't fighting with you down in the ditch. I'll meet you up here on the road. And I think that, is it worth the fight? Well, I don't have to fight every single day. I can go home and not have to worry about a lot of the things that my friends who are people of color have to worry about every single day. So yeah, it's worth the fight for me.
And that takes a lot of work and effort, because I think we're so accustomed to looking the other way, or I'm just not going to respond, or I'm not going to, engage you. But I think as long as we do that, those people are never challenged. They're never made to think. And I think that's where it comes in, is some point they will sit down and think about what they believe and change. But it's only going to come if we are willing to put the shame on them. And that's our family, friends, and people we know, our churches. One of my biggest disappointments in down south was I was told by a couple of mentor pastors to just, when I invited the guy to speak, that I should just let it go and tell him not to come because it's not worth making these people upset. And I said, well, if not me, who's ever going to hold them accountable and at least get them to think? I said, maybe that won't change their minds, but at least I'm going to make them think. And that was a big disappointment to see people that I trusted and admired. That was an issue they just weren't going to touch with a 10-foot pole. It just wasn't worth it to them. And I always thought that was kind of sad.
I think you just used a word that I want to back up to. You
Yep.
said shame. And I think there's a difference between shaming and holding someone accountable for their actions. And I think that shame isn't going to change hearts and minds, but bad behavior needs to be held accountable. And I think that's really, really, really important and critical to consider as we're talking about this work and moving forward, is that fine line of holding someone accountable for their actions and shaming them, because shaming is only going to dig that hole deeper and it's a lot harder to get out of.
Yeah, very true.
And you know, Wendy, that may be one of the reasons that we haven't moved any further ahead than we have. I do a lot of restorative work, and one of my restorative mentors said to me, I said, what do you mean by shame? And she said, never say anything that's going to make someone feel bad about who they are. You can talk about specifics. You know, well, when you did X, Y, Z, I felt bad, but don't ever say anything that shames somebody. And I think that's one of our undoing racism groups here in the city, the People's Institute. One of my restorative friends, when she moved here in 2000, did the workshop. And she said, oh my goodness, no wonder we still have a problem, because every white person in that group was made to feel ashamed of things they have said or things they haven't said. And she said, that is not going to get us anywhere. We have to quit shaming people. It is what it is. And we grow from, you know, but you don't when you're shamed. So thank you for bringing that up, Wendy.
Well, I will leave you with one last story. In my Navy career, I was a chaplain to a group of police officers. They were sea cops for the Navy, but in their real life, they were state troopers and police officers. And one of the men, a white guy, he was telling me his experience. He was dating a Hispanic girl, and he goes, I never saw her as Hispanic. He goes, she was beautiful. I saw her as that. We later got married, but he goes, one day we were driving up the interstate, and she had her arm hanging out the window. And we passed a spot in the road where he was a state trooper. He said a lot of the local deputy sheriffs would hang out there and try to pull people over. And he goes, 3 of them pulled us over that day. And he said, I knew why. And he goes, that was the first time in my life that I finally got it. They saw her arm and they targeted us. And he goes, because I never call in backup for a stop, but he goes, 3 cop cars pulled us over, harassed her, harassed me. He goes, I thought for a moment, but I decided, no, I wouldn't pull out my badge. I'd just let them have their fun. And he said, for 30 minutes, they harassed us as if we were scum. And he said, and so the next day, I got in my state trooper vehicle and I went and I found all 3 of them back at that stop. And I pulled in, arrested every single one of them, took them to the county jail, called the sheriff and said, your officers are in the county jail. And if I ever see them on that interstate, he said, it's not going to be pretty. But he was telling me, he goes, I never understood in my life what minorities were talking about until that day that me as a state trooper, a white state trooper, was pulled over and yanked out of the car because my girlfriend happened to be Hispanic and we were harassed for 30 minutes. He goes, they never once gave a reason why they pulled us over. They just harassed us. And he said, I will never forget that because of the pain I saw in her eyes. And, you know, don't know what it takes for all of us to wake up, but
That's right.
it's real. So it's 12 or 1 o'clock. Thank you for joining us. Next week, we're going to get into the real meat and potatoes of it with Wilkerson's book, Cast. For me, that's a very important book because I think she places her finger on the real problem in our country, is that way too many white men sit at the top of the pyramid and we're offended when somebody tries to take our place. And that's how she approaches racism. She goes, you need to look beyond racism. You need to see how America was created on a caste system. And that not only explains racism towards Black, but it explains sexism, it explains the treatment of Native Americans. She goes, it's white men who just have an issue with not being in charge anymore. And she brings out a lot of the history. I've tried to supplement that with a video of my own, but the history that I don't think many of us were ever taught. So I really encourage you to read the next couple of chapters in Cast and look at that video. And then maybe you could bring in your own historical things that you have found that you've never considered before. Up until a couple of years ago, I never knew about the race massacres that happened throughout our country, where governments were overturned and Black neighborhoods were wiped out because they were deemed too successful. So that's what we're going to be getting into the rest of this. So we'll repeat this tonight. If you know of anybody who wants to join, just send them our way.
Okay.
But thanks for your time.
Thank you, Blake. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you all for
Yeah,
letting
Bye,
me come
everyone.
in.
Nice to
Bye-bye.
meet you all.